Hello, this is Robert Rickover at Body Learning, and today my guest is Mark Josephsberg, an Alexander Technique teacher in New York City. And our topic today is going to be the different styles of Alexander Technique teaching. What are the different ways of teaching that a student might run into if they have Alexander lessons? And for this interview, Mark is actually going to interview me, although I'm sure he'll have some things to say. And so I'm going to turn it over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Robert. Welcome back to your show.
Oh, it's great being here.
I'll start by asking, what's important about this, since you picked out the topic, right?
Yep, I'm responsible.
You're responsible for it, and we don't know what we're going to talk about exactly, or I don't know what you're going to talk about exactly. What's important about this to you?
Well, I think that it's always, pretty much always been true, certainly since Alexander's death, and I think even before, and he died in 1955, that there's really no such thing as a standardized Alexander Technique lesson. There have always been different approaches to teaching. When he died, there were several teachers who created their own training courses for teachers and who have been very influential in this work. And of course, since then there have been second, third, fourth generation training courses, and there are some pretty big differences, I think, in how the technique is taught. And I think that it's just worth cataloging them a little bit, certainly from the point of view of a potential student who is thinking of taking lessons, so they have some idea of what the various possible ways of teaching they might encounter. And I think certainly someone who's thinking of joining a teacher training course might want to have some idea of how their course fits in with this. Mm-hmm. These breakdowns. And I want to say right off the bat that I don't want to make this a judgmental thing that some ways of teaching are better or worse than others. My own take on it is that there are excellent teachers in every one of the various possible divisions, let's say. Mm-hmm. This is more just to kind of get the information out there.
Okay, yeah, I'm interested in these divisions you call them, and you also call them categories.
Well, I have I came up with 5 categories in which there's, I think, there's a range that you could find teachers in, and I think the most important one, at least from my perspective, with the 2 most important, let's say, is one, teachers who are more interested in working with a student's thinking as opposed to more interested in doing hands-on work. Now, obviously, almost all teachers do both. So it's not a division so much as a range. I think there are some teachers that do very little speaking, and there are some teachers who use their hands very sparingly, and there are some teachers who don't use their hands at all. Mm-hmm. So that's an important distinction, I think, for anyone who's contemplating taking lessons, that there is this difference in a different approaches to teaching the basic principles of the Alexander Technique. Mm-hmm. So that's one of 2 that I consider probably the most important. The second one, which is a little bit related to it in some ways, is the range in terms of how much emphasis a teacher puts on basic Alexander Technique principles however they understand those principles, versus how much emphasis on using certain specific procedures for teaching the work.
Like
And most of those procedures were developed by Alexander himself, and he used them in his own teaching. There are a few that have been added since his death. And I don't want to imply that a teacher can't do both of those at the same time at all. I think most teachers who emphasize procedures using just a few standard procedures in their work would say they are working with the principles of the technique, and indeed I'm sure they are. But there are teachers who feel that the procedures are, in a sense, less important, and wouldn't feel it would be a terrible thing to just not use most of them.
Are you talking about procedures like whispered ah, hands on the back of the chair?
Yes, the standard, there are about a half a dozen. Whispered ah, hands on back of chair. I guess table work could be considered a procedure, chair work, the monkey. The lunge is often considered a procedure. I'm not sure if Alexander used that. You could probably think of a couple more. But there are some teachers who would argue that without using those procedures, you're not really teaching the Alexander technique. And there are teachers who would say, well, the procedures may have been useful for Alexander, but he never said that was how you had to teach. And they would say, really, the important thing Alexander discovered was some key principles, some key understandings of human functioning and how to change it.
Mm-hmm.
So that, I think that's a bit related to the mental hands-on division that we talked about before. There's some overlap there, but I think it's essentially a different category. And I think those two are the most important. And I think anyone coming for an Alexander lesson would probably do well to have that division in the back of their mind so they could get some idea of how the particular teacher they've gone to see fits into that framework. Mm-hmm. So, shall we move on? Or
yes.
Do you have any questions about those two?
Well, you were saying that you think those are the most important
of all the ones that I'm going to talk about.
So let's keep going then.
Yeah. Another division that is a more recent one, historically, maybe goes back 20 or 30 years, is does a teacher work only with individuals, one-on-one, or do they work with groups of people?
Mm-hmm.
And back in the day, when I was in England, there was a STAT meeting on this very topic, and group teaching was at the forefront, and it was very heated. There were very heated arguments about it. And I think that over the years, group work has become much more acceptable, although I also believe that a lot of teachers would argue that it's okay for certain things, but doesn't really substitute for individual lessons. And then there are, on the other hand, teachers who would argue not only is it as good, but in many ways it's better because of the fact that people get to observe changes in other people, that it's quite cost efficient, so on, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So that's an important range, and there are a lot of teachers who do some of one and some of another, but there are some teachers who I think feel very strongly that one of those two is way better than the other. So that's the third one.
Okay.
The fourth one is that some teachers, certainly when I was training in England, most teachers would only work with people in these fairly standard procedures that Alexander developed, and would not would very rarely venture outside of that. So if you were a musician and you were coming for lessons, it's not all that likely that a teacher in that group would work with you with your instrument, or they might after many lessons. Whereas today, certainly, there are a lot of teachers who, if a student calls and says they're a musician, they'd say, well, bring your instrument for the first lesson. Let's see what you do.
Right.
That's a relatively new development, I believe. And by that, I mean 20, 30 years or so. Doesn't seem like a daring thing, I think, to most teachers today to do some work, at least with a student in whatever activity they happen to be doing. But back in the day, I think it was. So that's a bit of a division.
Yeah. So procedures versus practical applications.
Yeah. Or when I was over in England in the late 70s, early 80s, the term was application work. And on my training course, Paul and Betty Collins were the directors of it, and they were, especially Paul, well, both of them really, were kind of at the cutting edge of application work at that time in England. I mean, Paul was a runner, and he would work with people running on Hampstead Heath, which I thought was really interesting. Not that I wanted to run, but I thought it was an interesting concept. It never occurred to me you could do that. But there were a lot of teachers who felt that was not a good idea, that you should stay within the basic framework that Alexander developed. So that's the fourth division. And are you ready for the fifth?
I'm ready for the fifth.
The fifth one is those teachers who think that when you're teaching the Alexander technique, you should really only be teaching the Alexander technique, and that you should not be teaching other things, such as yoga or Tai Chi or anything else, really. An Alexander lesson should be an Alexander lesson, and that you shouldn't really be combining it all that much with other fields. And on the other hand, there are a lot of teachers, say, for example, there are a fair number of musicians who've become Alexander teachers, and they may teach pretty standard Alexander lessons, but when a musician comes, part of what they might do is not just work with them playing their instrument in an Alexander way, but they might actually be working with them musically as well, offering, musical suggestions. Or there's some teachers who are yoga instructors, and they might have classes or individual lessons in which yoga principles or yoga ideas are kind of incorporated into Alexander, or vice versa. And I think that's kind of an important division of teachers as well.
That one would seem to be, I would think, the intention of the teacher, what the student thinks they're going to get, like right from the beginning. I think, is this going to be a music lesson combined with the Alexander? I mean, I would think they would, whatever they decide, as far as I'm concerned, is okay, as long as it's kind of set up that way. If the student is actually paying for an Alexander lesson, and then they start talking about chord progressions and other stuff, and they spend the whole time doing that.
Right. I think that is a legitimate concern. And I think even in, I'm not sure about STAT, but AMSAT probably has some rules about that you should make it very clear. If it's an Alexander lesson, it's an Alexander lesson. And if it's something else, it's something else. And if you're going to combine them, you should be very clear with your student that that's what you're going to do. And I personally don't have any quarrel with that. But I do think there certainly are Alexander teachers who give, for example, yoga workshops where they're working with yoga students in the practice of yoga, and they're bringing Alexander ideas to bear at the same time. And I think for the most part, those teachers are pretty clear what it is they're teaching. But that is a important distinction, because there are teachers who would think that's not a good idea just on the face of it.
Oh, what would be a good idea exactly?
To combine things like that.
Even if it's advertised as being
Even if
combined.
it's advertised. And in fact, that meeting I mentioned to you earlier, a STAT meeting back in London 35 years ago, that was, along with group teaching, that was the hot topic then. What was very popular in England at that time were these sort of weekend or week-long residential courses out in the country, and they might be just Alexander, or they might be horseback riding in Alexander, or yoga in Alexander, or singing in Alexander. And there were a lot of teachers who were very, very upset by that. I don't think you get that level of upsetness today, although I think you might run into it in some quarters.
Right.
So those are the divisions I can think of. Do you have any thoughts on other divisions?
Actually, I didn't think it was going to be, this was going to be the divisions. I think they're really interesting. I can't think of another one right now, except for just a big area of the general tone of the teacher, as far as a new student, a student checking out a teacher. The vibe of the teacher, whether or not they do basic procedures versus, basic principles versus the procedure, or more or less hands-on. Is it like a kind of a more of a serious vibe? Is it a light vibe?
Mm-hmm. Oh, you mean the personality of the teacher themselves?
Yeah, I think it's pretty huge.
Well, and it is, and I can't emphasize enough that Alexander technique lessons have never been standardized products, that everything depends on the particular teacher, their approach to teaching, their personality. And certainly I guess my advice to potential students would be, if you're somewhere where there's just one teacher, then just go to that teacher and see what you think. But you might have in the back of your mind some of these divisions that we're talking about.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And that might help you to evaluate them a bit. If you're somewhere where there's a choice of teachers, go to 2 or 3, and there may be one who's an absolutely superb teacher, but it's just not the right personality for you.
Yeah, definitely.
And they might be perfect for a friend of yours.
Every Alexander technique teacher is perfect for somebody.
Well, I hope so.
I'm going to say.
Yeah, I think that is true. I mean, when I look back to my first teacher, in some ways, he never talked about directions, for example. I mean, it was just pure hands-on stuff, pretty much. In some ways, looking back, he may have been the perfect teacher for me at that time. I might not have been in a place where thinking about directions would have made any sense.
Right.
So, it's just a case of finding out what works for you. And I think Barbara Conable, in her book, How to Learn the Alexander Technique, had some rough guidelines for people. If you leave a lesson feeling heavier or more uncomfortable than when you went, that might not be a good sign. Or if you dislike the teacher's personality, probably you should go elsewhere, that sort of thing. Just common sense advice.
Unless you leave a lesson, you feel heavier than when you went in, and for some reason, that's a good thing.
Yeah. I
mean, I could see that. It's very tricky stuff.
It is tricky. I mean, for a new student who's never had an Alexander lesson and comes to a teacher, they are really entering the unknown.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And, my advice in general would be patient. If you're not sure, and certainly if it's just one teacher, have two or three lessons, I think, should give you a pretty good idea if this is useful to you.
Might not be a bad idea to check out some reading material, either a book or some websites, a podcast or whatever.
Sure, whatever. I mean, anything you can do to inform yourself is likely to be helpful.
Right.
And I think just part of that self-informing process is having an idea of ways in which different teachers approach teaching the work.
Mm-hmm.
And I will say also that teachers themselves change a lot over the years. There are teachers who used to teach one way and now have completely changed.
Sure, there are teachers who experiment a lot and may change by the week or by the month also.
Absolutely. So I think that's really about all I have to say on the topic. Unless you have any other questions.
Let me look over these 5 areas really quickly. I think the first thing, working with the students' thinking, is probably, most people would say that's one of the primary things, no matter what the style is. Mm-hmm. One-to-one groups, procedures versus practical, whatever. It's working with the students' thinking, because if you're not working with the students' thinking in some way, then you're working just with their body.
Right. Well,
and then
I think
feeling.
it's a little bit how you would approach a new student. I think there are some teachers who would not want to get drawn into a lot of discussions about things like Alexander directions or whatever. They just want to give students some experience. Now, Walter Carrington, for example, who's a teacher I had tremendous respect for, once told me that he did everything he could do to avoid any mention of the Alexander technique for the first 10 lessons with a new student. And his reasoning was that what he wanted to do was get a new person to a point where they could appreciate the ideas. That was his thinking. Now, it has to be said that his clientele was a little skewed, I would say, in the direction of older people. Mm-hmm. But, it's an absolutely legitimate approach that he had. It isn't one that I have adopted, but, for him, it made perfect sense. And he helped a lot of people.
Yeah.
And ran a very successful training course, and he's had a huge influence on Alexander teaching today. So I don't put these out here in any kind of judgmental way. I'm just more straight information, consumer information.
Yeah, in that way, I have no more questions. I think they're really interesting, divisions, sort of.
Yeah, and if anyone listening to this podcast can think of a basic division that I've missed, please let me know. I hope at some point to write a little blog on this topic, and if you the listener have a basic division that I've overlooked, please let me know. So maybe
yes.
This is time to end our interview. What do you think?
It sounds good to me. Would you like to add anything else? Any kind of general summing up overall?
Well, I want to thank you for doing this. We have a pattern of me calling you or emailing you and saying, "Do you want to interview me?" And you write back, say, "Sure." You have any hint of what the topic might be?
That's right. I still don't understand what the topic. No, I understand it better now. But it's I've never thought about these divisions, or it's all on a continuum anyway.
It is pretty much all on a continuum. Yeah, there are very few people who are at the absolute far end of any of these.
Right.
I guess the nearest one would be people who use Skype for teaching.
Right.
Are pretty obviously not doing a whole lot of hands-on work. But other than that, I think all of these people, most teachers are somewhere in the range.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, Mark, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to ask you questions that you wanted me to ask you.
And let me just remind our listeners, Mark Josephsberg teaches the Alexander Technique in New York City. I will put a link to his website by the interview, and I'll also put a link to a site where you can learn more about the Alexander Technique. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Robert.